Hi, this lecture presents Mengzi's positive view about how we acquire virtues through a process of self-cultivation. Recall that the previous lecture presented Mengzi's defense of Confucianism in response to egoism, as represented by the Yangists, and the view that we ought to be totally impartial, as represented by the Moist view. And he defended Confucianism, Mengzi defended Confucianism, by relying on the assumption that we ought to act in accordance with human nature, an assumption shared by his opponents. But he argued for a different conception of human nature, one according to which we have innate feelings of care for others, feelings of compassion, and that we also have innate feelings of partiality, of respect for parents and loved ones. And Mengzi's thought is that since these feelings are innate, they're in line with our human nature, and that we ought to develop that human nature. Mengzi develops his positive ethical view by figuring out what human nature consists in. That is to say, by identifying various innate dispositions that are part of human nature. And since he holds the view that we ought to act in accordance with human nature, the idea will be that we ought to develop those innate dispositions further. And as we'll see in this lecture, there are 4 primary ethical reactions or dispositions toward certain feelings. These are compassion, disdain, respect, and approval/disapproval. We'll talk about each of those in turn in a little bit. The idea is that those are the innate dispositions we have, just mere potentialities, and that we can actualize them further by engaging in various practices and learning what the Confucians have to say, and that we'll develop those into virtues. The virtues of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom. Now, one of the key doctrines that Mengzi advocates for is that human nature is good. So these innate dispositions to have various feelings like compassion, these are essentially good. And this is going to be a doctrine adopted by Neo-Confucians much later, but it's also criticized by the philosopher Xunzi, whom we'll look at in the next lecture. But in any case, Mengzi thinks that human nature is good, and that's because human nature has the potential to do good things, to be good, to be virtuous. So he really just thinks that this is a potential human beings have. Some won't actualize that potential, some won't do good things or become good people. But human nature itself is that potentiality. And with that stress on goodness as something that's potential, Mengzi thinks that the primary ethical task is to actualize that potential, to develop it, to cultivate it, so that one can be actually good. Mengzi thinks that this innate goodness consists in 4 moral sprouts. So he uses a distinctive term there, this notion of sprout, this agricultural or horticultural term, so kind of the very beginning of a plant's development. And he thinks that each of us has that initial beginning, but they can grow into full plants for some people, but for others, they don't grow well. They get sick, they die, they wilt, whatever it is. So these 4 moral sprouts need to be watered, given proper food, light, and so on, and that's going to correspond to certain behaviors, certain teachings that you learn, and so on, to develop the virtues that Confucian morality advocates for. So what are the 4 moral sprouts? Well, he calls them the heart of compassion, the heart of disdain, the heart of respect, and the heart of approval and disapproval. So recall that we've seen some of this already in the previous lecture, this notion of compassion, we see that everyone has that heart of compassion, that innate disposition to have a feeling of compassion in reaction to certain circumstances, like seeing a child about to fall in a well. Likewise, we saw the other heart of respect, the third moral sprout here, when we considered the people that didn't respect their parents, just threw their parents' dead bodies into a ditch, and they reacted to that by sweating on their face, which indicated that they had this feeling that they did something wrong, that they disrespected their dead parents. And so various actions will indicate that sort of feeling. I'll talk a little bit later about the other two moral sprouts and what they consist in. But now it's time to look at the 4 virtues that these moral sprouts can be developed or cultivated into. Now, these are the virtues of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom. So these are 4 virtues that Confucius himself discussed, but Mengzi places a great emphasis on these 4 as opposed to others like trustworthiness. This is sort of a canonical list of 4 virtues that later philosophers like the Neo-Confucians will also adopt. And Mengzi really emphasizes that these 4 virtues are something that are internal to people. They're not something that we can add to a person, but rather they stem from a person organically, with that agricultural metaphor. We have them inherently, but not everyone's going to get them because not everyone seeks to become virtuous. Not everyone engages in the proper activities to cultivate those virtues. So they have those moral sprouts, they have that potential deep down, but it's not actualized. Much of what Mengzi does is to present various examples or thought experiments to show that we have these 4 moral sprouts. So we've seen that the child in the well example shows that we have the moral sprout of compassion that can become the virtue of benevolence. The improper burial of parents shows that we have the moral sprout of respect that can become the virtue of propriety. But then there's also the moral sprout of disdain or shame, which can be developed into the virtue of righteousness. And we'll see this example on the next slide, but basically, this feeling of disdain or shame is one that concerns oneself, one's view of oneself as doing something morally right or not. So it's a feeling of self-respect or the lack of respecting yourself. So that second moral sprout of disdain or shame is one's reaction to something internal to oneself, and the moral sprout of respect is a reaction to things that are external to yourself, your actions and other people. Now, the final moral sprout is approval and disapproval. Now, I haven't really been able to identify a great crystal clear example of this, but the basic idea here is that we in language make judgments, statements about things being right or things being wrong, and various courses of action that we ought to pursue or not. And so we can say, this is right, this is wrong, and the idea is that we have that innate disposition to label things in that way, to use that sort of language, but to use that sort of language well is to have the virtue of wisdom, to make reliably correct judgments about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, and so on. Mengzi argues that we have this moral sprout of disdain or shame by presenting the example of what someone would do that's in great need to preserve their life, that lacks basic necessities. And basically what Mengzi points out is that there are limits to what such a person will do, that person limits themselves in what they'll do. So everyone desires life, as he puts it, but you also have this innate desire to be righteous, to do morally right things with respect to your self-respect. And so everyone has this, and this is indicated when people are in dire need, so they're homeless, beggar, and they're presented with a basket of food, a bowl of soup. And you need that in order to keep living, but you won't accept that at any cost whatsoever. So if you're given those things with contempt, as he says, then even a homeless person will not accept them. Even a homeless person that needs them in order to keep living, they're not going to accept any handout because some of those will harm their image of themselves. Some of those will involve them giving up their self-respect. Now, Mengzi thinks that the primary ethical task is to cultivate this sort of feeling so that you have this feeling of self-respect that you want to preserve in a variety of other circumstances that the average person might not actually feel disdain or shame. So you'll feel disdain or shame at doing morally correct actions, such as telling a lie or other immoral behaviors. And so you want to preserve that more full-blooded feeling of self-respect in a variety of circumstances that the average person wouldn't. But of course, a variety of people do not develop those full virtues. And so Mengzi needs to provide an account of why some people don't develop these virtues. And he presents this through a metaphor. The metaphor is that there are trees on this mountain, Ox Mountain, that were beautiful. But that mountain was close to a society that wanted to use those trees, cut them down, use them to build houses, weapons, whatever it is. And so they cut those trees down with the result that Ox Mountain is barren and it looks terrible. Mengzi says, quote, "It was not that there were no sprouts or shoots growing there," end quote. So his point is, this mountain that looks barren, that looks like it's in a bad, ugly condition, actually had a potential all along. It was still getting some good, light, some good water, and so on, but it just wasn't taken proper care of. And it wasn't taken proper care of by these people that came along, cut it down. And so the task for us is to figure out how to take proper care of our moral sprouts. And I'll end this lecture by presenting another metaphor that Mengzi presents. So what Mengzi says is that, quote, "One must work at it, work at becoming virtuous. But do not aim at it directly. Let the heart not forget, but do not help it grow," end quote. So the point there is that we shouldn't really force things. So we are aiming at it in a way, but we don't want to force it. So how are we supposed to understand that? Here's where the metaphor comes in. He says, quote, "Do not be like the man from Song." So who is the man from Song? Well, he's someone that wanted to grow his plants, wanted to grow his garden. But so concerned was he that he, quote, "pulled on it. And warily he returned home and said to his family, 'Today I'm worn out. I helped the grain to grow.'" He was just pulling on the plants all day is basically the thought. But then, quote, "his son rushed out and looked at it. The grain was withered," end quote. So his point is that by trying to force things, this man from Song ended up killing the plants. He ended up not cultivating the plants in the appropriate way. And so moral development, this process of self-cultivation to develop virtues such as benevolence and wisdom and so on, that needs to proceed by giving the moral sprouts the proper environment. And so letting them grow organically from that inner potential. So that concludes our focused look at Mengzi. In the next lectures, I'm going to present a competing account of what self-cultivation consists in.